Welcome to this episode of Bed Talk, which is basically just a mini tiny little informational video like a TED Talk, but from our beds. This one will be on loneliness and how it can be explored through art and poetry. So, let's go. So, this talk will be in three parts. First, we'll have a definition of loneliness and how it's been seen through the ages, very quick. And then we'll talk about loneliness through Hopper's painting, Nighthawks. And then thirdly, we'll talk about Frank O'Hara's poem, Morning. For our definition of loneliness, we're going to look at Olivia Lang's book, The Lonely City, which this talk is based on. Basically, The Lonely City is a book that she wrote about loneliness and loneliness specifically in New York and how it's represented through New York artists such as Worrell and Hopper. But she does give a very good kind of overview of how loneliness has been seen and described. One of those is by psychologist Robert Weiss, who says it's a chronic disease without any redeeming features. Now, this, as well as the dictionary definition, which is a negative feeling invoked by isolation, dictionary definition of loneliness, kind of shows us that it's been seen as this very negative thing that comes from being isolated. The only issue is that, I think as we all know, you can be surrounded by people, be in a crowd, and still feel very lonely. So there's more to explore than the, classic definition that we get of it. And one last point that I'll make before going into the actual art is that one of the most important thinkers of loneliness is German psychiatrist Frieda from Reichmann, because she kind of went deeper into it. She looked more into, the complexity of it, and she says that loneliness in quintessential form is of a nature that is incommunicable by the one who suffers it. And I think that's a very, very important feature of it, is that once it goes away and you're not lonely anymore, it's one of those things that's very hard to, not necessarily to reminisce, but to communicate, to make other people understand. And fundamentally, even if you look at French philosophy, Lévinas, who is a French philosopher, he says that loneliness is, one of the fundamental thing of the human experience, because you'll never get to experience someone else's life truly. Like, you can only be yourself. And that's why you're condemned to be lonely, because you'll never live as other people. And therefore, you'll only ever be yourself. And I think that's very interesting and something that is definitely seen in the art that we'll be talking about. Now I think is a good time to get into Hopper. This part on Hopper is mainly, once again, Olivia Lang's thoughts on the matter. I think she did a very good job of kind of gathering knowledge on Hopper and how he depicts loneliness. She says that, very importantly, Hopper doesn't just paint it, but he represents how it feels to be lonely. She says that the blank walls and open windows are simulacrums of the paranoid architecture of loneliness, the way loneliness works to both entrap and expose. What she's communicating, what she's, telling us, is that if you look at the painting, this big glass window looks open, like an open space, an exposed space, but truly there's no door. If you look, there's only a door in the back of the painting, so the back door, but it doesn't look like you can enter it, and the big blank walls also play into that. It's the evil twin mechanism of entrapping and exposing. That's what loneliness does to, to a person. It alienates you, but it also exposes you, kind of makes you very vulnerable. So she likens this to the window that we can see Nighthawks. Another point that she makes is that often the viewpoint adopted by Hopper is described as voyeuristic. But for because if you look at Nighthawks, for example, it's like you're looking into a scene that maybe you shouldn't be looking into. But for her, he's just replicating the central experience of living in a big city, of being lonely. I kind of like this idea that Hopper is not just being a voyeur and exposing these people. I think it's one of the central experiences of loneliness. It creates even more tension that's palpable. Joyce Carol Oates said about Nighthawks that it is the most poignant, ceaselessly replicated image of American loneliness. And interestingly enough, Hopper had been asked many times in interviews, is this loneliness? Is it about the experience of being lonely? And he always said, no, I don't know. Or like, he only conceded to saying that maybe unconsciously it is. Which I think is an interesting point because maybe it's one of those things that's so, that can hurt so much and be so personal that you wouldn't want admit that even if you paint something like Nighthawks. I think the interesting part is that the diner isn't just one person in an empty diner. There's four figures, but none of them are really looking or talking to each other. You have the figure where you can only see his back, um, very mysterious, but we don't know even what that person looks like. The couple aren't looking at each other either. They're kind of like diverting their gaze. And the counter boy who's presiding over the coffee, he also looks busy or daydreaming, and that's one of the central parts of this painting is that four of the figures embody loneliness in a different way. Even though they're standing close to each other, they seem cold and happy. And interestingly enough, Hopper himself, at the time that the painting was painted, was going through a lot with his wife. And World War II was happening. New York was always under threat of being bombed and blackouts. Um, which we have to be careful of, linking biographical facts to paintings. But I do think that is palpable in Nighthawks. Also, she collaborated with him on everything. So they came up with titles together, and she posed to be all the models, which I think is pretty interesting because she often talked his wife about being very lonely in this marriage, and yet she's many people. She's all of the women in his paintings. So to summarize this little part on Hopper, I would say that Nighthawks is a depiction of the idea of great American loneliness from living in these big urban spaces such as New York. I would also say that the window is one of the most important windows in art in the sense that it's very unique. It's not a realistic window. It's a representation of being walled in and separated, but also exposed. And that the context in which this was painted, I think, might explain a lot about it. Now, I want to explore an artist that I don't think is known for talking about loneliness. I want to talk about Frank O'Hara, who was a kind of around the same time as Hopper. He was a poet in the 50s. He died in 1960. And he was famous in the gay community of New York, and he wrote a lot about love. He had many lovers, and he loved writing about love. This one poem that we're going to look at is called Morning. I've got to tell you how I love you always. I think of it on grey mornings with death. In my mouth the tea's never hot enough. Then and the cigarette dry. The maroon robe chills me. I need you. And look out the window at the noiseless snow. At night on the dock, the buses glow like clouds, and I am lonely thinking of flutes. I miss you always. When I go to the beach, the sand is wet with tears that seem mine. Although I never weep and hold you in my heart with the very real humor you'd be proud of. The parking lot is crowded, and I stand rattling my keys. The car is empty as a bicycle. What are you doing now? Why did you eat your lunch? And were there lots of anchovies in it? It is difficult to think of you without me in the sentence. You depress me when you are alone. Last night the stars were numerous, and today snow is their calling. I'll not be cordial. There is nothing that distracts me. Music is only a crossword puzzle. Do you know how it is? When you are the only passenger, if there is a place further from me, I beg you, do not go. I think he's writing about a person that he's in love with. And the feeling of loneliness that being away from that person causes, which I think is one of the most common ways that one can feel lonely, is separated from someone that they love. I think this is especially true when he says, it is difficult to think of you without me in the sentence. You depress me when you are alone. So it's not just him that's alone. It's also his lover. It's him without the other person. Makes it like he's not whole, and therefore that creates this a feeling of emptiness. Another point that is raised is that you can be the loneliest person even in a crowd. It's not about numbers. It's not about necessarily being physically isolated. Yet he says, at night on the dock, the buses glow like clouds, and I'm lonely thinking of flutes. I miss you always. The parking lot is crowded, and I stand rattling my keys. The car is empty as a bicycle. So he's thinking of that person, and it's making him sad and making him lonely, and that's only heightened by the fact that he's standing in a crowd in the parking lot, and he's there with his keys, and he doesn't know what to do. Lastly, something that I think is very important about O'Hara is that he uses very mundane, everyday things to communicate to the reader how he feels. That's why he mentioned things like lunch, the beach, the morning tea and cigarettes, the mornings with death, the gray mornings. All of these things are sources of pain for him, because he's imagining, or maybe he's already going through it, that he'll have to do these things without the person that he loves, which creates nostalgia at the same time as putting him in a state of lack. And something that I want to end this talk on is that when thinking about loneliness, it could be with Frank O'Hara or with Hopper, or just the clinical definition of it, that lack is more important than isolation, because you could be with many people and still feel lonely. But it's the lack of maybe of attention, of affection, or maybe it just comes from you. Maybe it's just the lack of even of everyday excitement that can create this thing. I want to thank you for coming to this bed talk, and I encourage you to check out Frank O'Hara's poems, and Hopper's paintings. Maybe look at it again, look at the figures, look at the window, look at how they all communicate this painful thing that we go through, especially in lockdown. It's actually been very therapeutic for me to think of loneliness and art, and of reading this book too. This is Lunch Poems, Frank O'Hara, and this is The Lonely City, which inspired this talk. So check it out.